October 28th, 2025. That's a date that will be seared into Jamaica's collective memory for generations. On that Tuesday morning, Hurricane Melissa made landfall near New Hope in Westmoreland Parish as a Category 5 monster with sustained winds of 185 miles per hour. To put that in perspective, this wasn't just another hurricane. This was the strongest storm to ever strike Jamaica since record-keeping began in 1851. That's 174 years of hurricanes, tropical storms, and bad weather, and nothing had ever come close to what Melissa brought to the island, the storm that shattered all records. Before Melissa, if you asked older Jamaicans about the worst hurricane they'd lived through, most would tell you about Hurricane Gilbert. Gilbert hit in September 1988 as a Category 3 to 4 storm with winds around 125 miles per hour. It killed at least 40 people, caused about $2.5 billion in damage, and became the benchmark for what a devastating hurricane looked like in Jamaica. There's a whole generation of Jamaicans whose understanding of hurricanes was shaped by Gilbert, but Melissa made Gilbert look tame by comparison. The numbers alone tell part of the story. Melissa peaked with a minimum central pressure of 892 millibars about 45 miles south of Jamaica. For context, the lower the pressure, the more powerful the storm. Melissa's pressure reading tied it with the 1935 Labor Day hurricane as the third most intense Atlantic hurricane ever recorded. The wind speed of 185 miles per hour at landfall tied it with 4 other storms as the second strongest landfall in Atlantic history. This wasn't some run-of-the-mill hurricane season storm. This was a meteorological nightmare, and it was heading straight for an island of 2.8 million people. In the days before Melissa arrived, the warnings from meteorologists weren't just urgent, they were terrifying. The National Hurricane Center used words like catastrophic and unsurvivable to describe what was coming. Jamaica's Meteorological Service, along with Prime Minister Andrew Holness, issued increasingly dire warnings. Mandatory evacuation orders went out for several vulnerable coastal communities, including parts of Kingston. Holness told the nation that hurricane conditions would linger over Jamaica because of the storm's slow-moving nature, leading to extended rainfall and expected flash flooding throughout the island. He warned that buildings and activities in or along hilly areas would be at high risk of damage, complete displacement, and loss of life. For many Jamaicans, especially those who'd lived through Gilbert, there was a strange mix of preparation and dread. Michelle Robinson, an attorney who splits her time between Kingston and Brooklyn, told reporters that many people had lived through Gilbert and knew what was coming would be worse. Vanetta McIntosh, a woman from Crown Heights who'd recently moved to Jamaica, spent that Sunday in church writing prayer requests for the whole country. The mood across the island was heavy. This wasn't panic exactly, but a grim understanding that something unprecedented was about to happen. Melissa spent Sunday, October 27th, crawling westward at just 3 miles per hour, sitting about 145 miles southwest of Kingston. This slow movement was almost worse than if it had been racing forward. It gave people more time to prepare, sure, but it also meant the storm would linger over Jamaica longer once it arrived. By Monday evening, October 27th, Melissa had strengthened to 175 miles per hour and was still intensifying. The outer band started lashing Jamaica's southeastern coast. Rain began falling, winds picked up, and then, Tuesday morning, the eye came ashore. Landfall, a nation under siege. Hurricane Melissa made landfall near New Hope, Westmoreland, around midday on Tuesday, October 28th. The eye then raked diagonally across western Jamaica, entering in the south and exiting somewhere around St. Ann Parish in the north. The parishes in the storm's direct path, St. Elizabeth, Westmoreland, Hanover, St. James, and Trelawney, took the absolute worst of it. When a Category 5 hurricane makes landfall with 185 mile per hour winds, the destruction is almost incomprehensible. We're talking about winds strong enough to turn sheet metal into projectiles, to peel roofs off concrete buildings like they're made of cardboard, to snap power poles and uproot massive trees. The town of Black River in St. Elizabeth Parish was essentially ground zero. Prime Minister Holness, during a helicopter tour of the area after the storm, told residents that 90% of structures in Black River and nearby St. Elizabeth sustained damage. 90%. That means 9 out of every 10 buildings, homes, businesses, churches, schools, government offices, were either severely damaged or completely destroyed. The mayor of Black River, Richard Solomon, recorded a video message shortly after the storm passed. His voice was shaking. "The conditions here are devastating," he said. "Catastrophic is a mild term based on what we are observing here. Entire neighborhoods that had stood for decades just ceased to exist. Roofs weren't just damaged, they were torn completely off and carried hundreds of feet away. Walls collapsed. Even concrete structures that people thought would protect them were ripped apart by winds that defied imagination. One resident described it as wholesale destruction. Not just one or two houses damaged, but entire communities flattened. The landscape of western Jamaica was fundamentally altered in the span of a few hours. But the wind wasn't the only killer. Hurricane Melissa brought a storm surge of up to 13 feet in some areas along Jamaica's southern coast, though some reports put it as high as 16 feet in certain locations. A storm surge is essentially the ocean being pushed onto land by the hurricane's winds. Imagine a wall of water 13 to 16 feet high, suddenly flooding coastal communities. Cars were submerged. Ground floors of buildings disappeared under murky, debris-filled salt water. Coastal areas that had always dealt with some flooding during storms had never seen anything remotely like this. And then the rain. Melissa dumped torrential rainfall across Jamaica. Parts of eastern Jamaica saw up to 30 inches of rain, with some isolated areas potentially getting 40 inches. That's more than 3 feet of water falling from the sky. In the mountainous interior, all that rain triggered massive landslides that buried roads and cut off communities. In low-lying areas, drainage systems were completely overwhelmed. Streets became rivers filled with mud, debris, tree branches, pieces of buildings, furniture, and cars all churning together in a destructive mess. Total blackout. When Jamaica went dark. By Monday evening, before the worst of the storm had even hit, about 200,000 customers, roughly 35% of homes and businesses, had already lost power. By Tuesday afternoon, after Melissa came ashore, that number jumped to 530,000 customers. At the height of the storm, 77% of Jamaica's homes and businesses were without electricity. Transmission lines were snapped by falling trees and flying debris. Substations flooded. Entire sections of the electrical grid simply ceased to function. The parishes that took the direct hit, St. Elizabeth, Westmoreland, St. James, Trelawney, and Hanover, lost all power. Complete blackout. Communication networks collapsed next. Cell towers were knocked down. The parishes that received the worst of Melissa's impacts lost all communication. There was a total communication blackout in some communities. People couldn't call for help. They couldn't check on family members. Emergency services couldn't coordinate. Around 140,000 people were cut off from the rest of Jamaica and the world, isolated in their suffering with no way to let anyone know what was happening. In the middle of all this chaos, there were acts of incredible courage. The Black River Hospital took a direct hit from Melissa's eye. The building lost power, windows blew out, pieces of the roof were torn away, parts of the structure were damaged so badly that it would later have to be evacuated entirely. But during the storm, the medical staff stayed. Prime Minister Holness later visited the hospital and spoke with the workers who'd been there. The most terrifying experience of my life, and I would not want to see it again, one staff member told him. Holness praised them for continuing to care for patients through the horrific Category 5 storm, even when the power went out and they were forced to use flashlights and lanterns to see. One hospital staffer described having to dodge pieces of flying glass and other debris as the storm blew out windows and shook the facility. These people stayed at their posts, protecting the most vulnerable, while a monster hurricane literally destroyed the building around them. The aftermath, counting the dead and displaced. As dawn broke on Wednesday, October 29th, and Melissa finally moved away from Jamaica toward Cuba, the true scale of the disaster became clear. The death toll began almost immediately. By October 27th, before Melissa even made landfall, 3 people had already died in St. Elizabeth, St. Catherine, and Hanover parishes from indirect causes while preparing for the hurricane. 13 others were injured. By Thursday, October 30th, officials confirmed at least 14 deaths in Jamaica. By Friday, that number had grown. Within a week, the confirmed death toll reached 32. By mid-November, it stood at 45, with 15 other people still missing. In disasters like this, the initial death toll is always just a fraction of the final count. People trapped in collapsed buildings, victims of flooding who couldn't be reached in time, medical emergencies that couldn't be treated because hospitals were damaged or roads were blocked. In one isolated community, residents pleaded with officials to remove the body of a victim that was tangled in a tree. The human cost of Hurricane Melissa would take weeks to fully understand. More than 25,000 Jamaicans found themselves in emergency shelters immediately after the storm. By Thursday, that number was over 13,000, as some people who'd evacuated as a precaution returned home. But tens of thousands had homes that were gone. destroyed, flooded, or too dangerous to return to. These shelters, located in schools and community centers across Jamaica, were packed with people who'd lost everything. Families with young children, elderly residents, people with disabilities, all of them suddenly homeless, sharing crowded spaces, unsure when or if they'd be able to return to what used to be their lives. The Jamaican government responded quickly. The entire island was declared a disaster area, which expedited emergency aid and unlocked resources for recovery. In an address to the nation, Prime Minister Holness described the situation in stark terms. There was widespread damage across Jamaica. Some communities, he said, no longer looked the same. He wasn't exaggerating. Video footage from his helicopter tour of the hardest hit areas showed communities left in ruins. Entire neighborhoods were devastated, with numerous homes missing roofs and walls. In some shots, you could see twisted metal, splintered wood, and chunks of broken concrete strewn across the green landscape for miles. Where there had once been orderly communities, there were now fields of debris. Emergency crews and soldiers deployed across the island as soon as it was safe to move. Their mission was urgent: search and rescue operations to find anyone still trapped, clearing roads so aid could reach isolated communities, and establishing emergency supply points. But the sheer scale of destruction made even basic tasks incredibly difficult. Roads were blocked by fallen trees, downed power lines, and mountains of debris. In some areas, crews had to literally cut their way through on foot. Dana Morris Dixon, the Minister of Education, described military teams cutting through thick bamboo to reach isolated areas, work they couldn't finish in one day and had to resume the next morning. For the people of Western Jamaica, particularly those in the hardest hit areas, the immediate aftermath was overwhelming. How do you even begin to process that level of destruction? Christopher Box, a restaurant owner in Kingston, described it as living in two Jamaicas, one where most people were going to work with minimal damage, and another half that looked devastated and heartbreaking. In Black River and surrounding communities, residents formed long lines at the few gas stations and supermarkets that could open. People clutched cash, desperate for fuel, food, and clean water. Those without running water turned to the river or rainwater pipes. At one damaged supermarket in Black River, dozens of residents were seen clearing out the shelves, taking basic necessities like food and water. One resident told CNN reporters, "There's no looting. This is trying to survive. It's a survival thing right now." He pointed out that police were also at the scene, not to deter people, but to help them. When your town has been essentially destroyed, when there's no power, no water, no communication, and you have hungry children, the normal rules change. People were just trying to stay alive. Global response: the world steps up. Aid started pouring in almost immediately. The United States pledged $11 million initially, later adding another $10 million for a total of nearly $37 million in assistance. The British government offered full support through Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper, positioning specialist rapid deployment teams to provide consular assistance to British nationals in the region. The UN's International Organization for Migration dispatched solar lamps, blankets, indoor tents, generators, and other items from its logistics hub in Barbados. China sent hundreds of boxes of family kits with footwear, toothbrushes, utensils, bowls, umbrellas, and thermal blankets through the Chinese Red Cross. B-roll, Samaritan's Purse teams setting up field hospital. B-roll, World Central Kitchen preparing meals. Relief organizations like Samaritan's Purse, World Central Kitchen, Operation Blessing, and Direct Relief mobilized teams and supplies. Less than 48 hours after Melissa made landfall, Samaritan's Purse had airlifted the first members of their disaster assistance response team to Jamaica. By early November, they'd established a full emergency field hospital at Black River High School, complete with over 30 beds, an operating room, intensive care unit, emergency room, obstetrics ward, laboratory, pharmacy, and blood bank. The facility was staffed by more than 60 people, including doctors and nurses, designed to replicate the capabilities of the destroyed Black River Hospital. A second field hospital from Spain's cooperation agency was set up in Falmouth, Trelawney. The Jamaican diaspora around the world sprang into action. In cities like New York, Toronto, London, and Miami, Jamaicans organized fundraisers and supply drives. Social media filled with images of the destruction, appeals for help, and desperate updates from people trying to locate missing family members. The global community watched, contributed what they could, and shared information to help coordinate relief efforts. Beyond Jamaica, Melissa's Caribbean rampage. After devastating Jamaica, Hurricane Melissa continued on its destructive path. The The storm moved toward Cuba, making landfall east of Chivirico in Santiago de Cuba around 7:10 a.m. UTC on October 29th as a Category 3 hurricane with 120-mile-per-hour winds. Cuba had evacuated more than 735,000 people across eastern provinces ahead of the storm, likely saving countless lives. No deaths were reported in Cuba, though the damage to homes, crops, and infrastructure was significant. The town of El Cobre, home to about 7,000 people, and the Basilica of Our Lady of Charity was particularly hard hit. Haiti, already dealing with political instability and food insecurity, suffered catastrophically from Melissa's outer bands. At least 43 people were killed in Haiti, many in the town of Petit Goave, where a flooded river burst its banks. 20 people died in that single incident, including 10 children. Stephen Guadard, a resident of Petit Goave, told reporters that Melissa killed his entire family. 4 children ranging in age from 1 month to 8 years old. More than 160 homes were damaged and 80 others destroyed in Petit Goave alone. The storm destroyed crops in 3 regions at a time when more than half of Haiti's population was already experiencing crisis levels of hunger. Melissa then curved back out into the Atlantic, weakening somewhat but still dangerous, and headed toward Bermuda. The storm passed near Bermuda as a Category 2 hurricane before finally transitioning to an extratropical system on October 31st northeast of the island. The remnants gradually weakened over the next few days, finally dissipating on November 4th. The long road to recovery, Jamaica rebuilds. For Jamaica, though, Melissa's departure brought no relief, only the beginning of a long, painful process of recovery. The numbers told part of the story. Total economic damage across the Caribbean was estimated between $48 billion and $52 billion. In Jamaica alone, insured losses were estimated between $2.2 billion and $4.2 billion, according to Verisk. Satellite imagery captured the transformation. NASA's Earth Observatory released nighttime images comparing October 19th to November 13th, showing that many smaller inland areas were still without power 2.5 weeks after the storm. A Bloomberg analysis of satellite data found that at least 76% of buildings in Black River were damaged, many with collapsed roofs. The town that had been a vibrant coastal community was now, as one visiting resident described it, hell on earth. At the 2025 United Nations Climate Change Conference in mid-November, Jamaica's Economic Growth Minister Matthew Samuda told delegates, Hurricane Melissa changed the life of every Jamaican in less than 24 hours. He identified the hurricane as evidence of the new phase of climate change and called on the global community to fulfill their commitments to mitigating the worst effects. Scientists had noted that Melissa's intensity was fueled by unusually warm sea surface temperatures in the Caribbean, waters ranging from 86 to 88 degrees Fahrenheit. Warmer oceans provide more energy for hurricanes, and as climate patterns shift, the potential for these catastrophic megastorms increases. Yet even in the darkest moments, the spirit that makes Jamaica special showed through. Neighbors helping neighbors, communities coming together to clear debris and check on the vulnerable. Former Member of Parliament Lisa Hanna described it as an empathetic solidarity across the island and across the world. She said, "We are resilient. We're not going to make our people starve." Residents became their own first responders, moving fallen trees, lifting tangled wires, hammering tin over broken beams. They rebuilt because they had to, knowing help was coming, but not soon enough. Hurricane Melissa will be remembered as the strongest storm to ever strike Jamaica in recorded history, a Category 5 monster that rewrote the island's history and left scars that will take a generation to fully heal. The final death toll in Jamaica reached at least 45, with 15 others still missing as of mid-November. Across the entire Caribbean, at least 67 people lost their lives. Tens of thousands were left homeless. Entire communities were erased. The economic cost ran into the tens of billions of dollars. But this is also a story of survival, of medical workers who stayed at their posts while a hurricane destroyed the building around them, of evacuations that saved countless lives, of communities that came together in the aftermath, of international solidarity and rapid response, of a nation that, despite being knocked to its knees, refused to stay down. The recovery is far from over. As of mid-November 2025, field hospitals were still operating in Black River and Falmouth. Relief organizations expected to stay for months, maybe years. Thousands remained displaced. Much of Western Jamaica still showed the wounds of Melissa's passage. The tourism industry, a backbone of Jamaica's economy, was working to assure visitors that much of the island, especially the north and east, remained open and ready to welcome them as peak season approached. In the years to come, when Jamaicans tell stories about where they were on October 28, 2025, they'll remember the sound of 185-mile-per-hour winds. They'll remember the fear, the darkness, the isolation. They'll remember neighbors and family members lost. They'll remember the smell of wet wood and salt in the air after the storm passed. But they'll also remember the resilience, the solidarity, and the determination to rebuild. Hurricane Melissa changed Jamaica, but it didn't break it. Text overlay. For information on how to help Jamaica's recovery, visit charity websites.